Okay, well, welcome everyone. It's good to see you. I'm pleased that the title didn't put you off. The thing is, you don't really need to know even who the philosopher Hegel was to be able to understand this lecture. What I want to address today, as Stephen said, is the issue of how the church can be salt and light, how the church can respond transformatively to a situation of conflict, crisis, and of violence. And so I've entitled the seminar today, "No Revolution Without Reformation." This is a direct quotation from the philosopher Hegel. I'll try to explain a little bit about what he meant by that. And so I want to offer a so-called Hegelian reading of Maidan as a civil and religious reformation. Ukraine today is experiencing a period of profound transition that has been triggered by a deep tectonic shift in the foundations of the post-Soviet political and social order. The demonstrations on Kiev's Maidan Nezalezhnosti, or Independence Square in English, in 2013 and 2014, this revolution can rightly be understood as Ukraine's revolution of dignity and freedom. The Maidan revolution was the result of an unprecedented mass mobilization of Ukrainian civil society, which rose up against a corrupt state that had become irretrievably detached from the people, whose liberties and interests it was constitutionally obliged to serve and represent. And as well as attempting to impose unprecedented restrictions on the civil liberties of the Ukrainian people, the sociopathic state, under the rule of the criminal reprobate Viktor Yanukovych, had even resorted to murdering dozens of its own citizens, including many Christians, by the way. So despite all the Russian propaganda about the so-called Ukrainian fascists in Kiev and the fabricated threats to Russian citizens in Ukraine, the main aims of the Ukrainian revolution were social justice, democracy, and the rule of law. At Maidan, the people of Ukraine rose up against a corrupt regime that had attempted to turn the organs of state power into the instruments for the repression of all civil and political opposition. Under Viktor Yanukovych, the state, the Ukrainian state, had become a vehicle for the self-enrichment of the president's family and the narrow circle of oligarchs and regime insiders. Now, there had been other episodes of revolutionary ferment in post-Soviet Ukraine. In 1991, Ukraine declared its independence from the Soviet Union. And in 2004 to 2005, hundreds of thousands of protesters took to the streets in a series of demonstrations that became known as the Orange Revolution. One of the key differences between Maidan and the earlier episodes has been the unprecedented ecumenical mobilization of all the main Ukrainian churches in support of the civil demonstrations in defense of fundamental human values, also Christian values, of dignity and freedom. So in this seminar, I want to argue that Maidan signals the coming of age of Ukrainian civil society and the coming of age of the Ukrainian churches. And I want to show how this revolution will have major implications that extend far beyond the national boundaries of Ukraine to Eastern Europe, even to the whole of Europe, and ultimately to us here in Britain. The future of Europe, to a large extent, I would argue, depends on the future of Ukraine. If Ukraine doesn't have a future, neither does Europe. So my main aim today is to demonstrate how the churches can be in the vanguard of a new movement for the reformation of the church and the renewal of society, which in the Ukrainian context would cast off the dismal legacy of corruption, inhumanity, inefficiency, unaccountability, and servitude, vices that were associated with the Soviet past. And I want to think about a church that moves towards an open future with hope for greater freedom. And so I want to use this perhaps seemingly arcane concept of the German philosopher Hegel of civil society. He was German, so he didn't write about civil society. He referred to bürgerliche Gesellschaft. And I want to use this concept as a point of departure for reflecting on the significance of the Ukrainian Revolution, particularly in relation to recent political, social, and religious events and processes in the post-Soviet space as a whole. So let's consider Maidan as a Hegelian event. Although the Ukrainian Declaration of Independence in 1991 and the Orange Revolution of 2014, these were clearly revolutionary events, but they were not accompanied by the creation of the kind of active civil society that would have enabled a genuine grassroots democracy to gain a foothold in Ukrainian society. Following the ignominious demise of the discredited Soviet Union, Ukraine became politically independent in 1991. But the dominant apparatchiks, or the bureaucrats of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, retained their influence in the power structures of the new so-called post-Soviet Ukrainian state. Similarly, even after the disruptions of the Orange Revolution in 2004 to 2005, Ukraine remained a state that was essentially under the control of a few oligarch clans. So on the surface it appeared that everything had changed. On the subsurface, actually very little had changed. It's like the old joke, what's the difference between capitalism and communism? Well, in capitalism, man exploits man, and in communism, it's the other way round. Anyway, this meant that once the dust from the revolutionary ferment had settled, the social structures and the value systems that had sustained the Soviet regime once again began to reassert their dominance over Ukrainian public life. In 1991 and 2004, the problem lay not in the intentions of the revolutionaries, but in the failure of the population as a whole to reform the deep structures of social consciousness. The German philosopher G.W.F. Hegel, whose social philosophy, by the way, indirectly through Karl Marx, Karl Marx was one of Hegel's leading disciples. Hegel's ideas through Karl Marx became very influential in Soviet society. And you can still walk through the thoroughfares of Ukrainian cities today that are called, have ridiculous communist Soviet-sounding names like Lenin Alley, Karl Marx Boulevard, etc. But Hegel remarked that, and I quote, "It is a modern folly to alter a corrupt ethical system, its constitution and legislation, without changing the religion, i.e., to have a revolution without a reformation." Revolutions that transfer the powers of the state from one ruling elite to another are unworthy of the name revolution. These kinds of revolution can only destroy the old order. They're absolutely incapable of constructing a new society. A fundamental change in social consciousness couldn't be brought about by political means, but only by a spiritual awakening, i.e., a reformation, which would lead to a greater realization of the consciousness of freedom, to use a Hegelian term, the consciousness of freedom on the part of an entire population. Moreover, the guiding principle of the historicist vision articulated by Hegel was that history possesses what he called a narrative of directionality and purpose. History, said Hegel, is driven by spiritual forces. It's not driven by human beings. History is driven by spiritual forces that underlie particular events. Human beings, according to Hegel, are not the subjects of history, but are rather its objects. History uses human beings for its own purposes, and Hegel used the term the cunning of reason, or die List der Vernunft, which directs all events towards history's ausgeführte Zweck, or the realized end that is known only to the Weltgeist, or to the world spirit. So, taking Hegel's ideas as a point of departure, I want to argue that the Ukrainian revolution of dignity and freedom can be characterized as a Hegelian event. It was a Hegelian event insofar as it led not only to a shake-up of existing political structures, but to the creation of a new civil consciousness and awareness of the value of freedom among the Ukrainian people as a whole. The revolution on Maidan has opened the door to evident and irreversible social and even anthropological metamorphoses that have been long in the making. After the Ukrainian revolution of dignity and freedom last year, the takeover of Crimea was launched. And it was immediately apparent who was supporting President Viktor Yanukovych's kleptocratic regime and its criminal activities. Russia removed its mask. The so-called brother at the gates appeared, armed with weapons, hatred, and the mendacious fabrications of its state-monopolized media outlets. Lying has become an art form in the Russian media. It has to be seen to be believed sometimes. From the Hegelian perspective of the cunning of reason, it can even be posited that even the attempt by Putin's Russia to turn Ukraine into its own image has ironically led to a greater consciousness of freedom and democracy on the part of the Ukrainian people. When I talk about turning Ukraine into Russia, I'm referring to Putin's attempt to turn Ukraine into an authoritarian failed state controlled by an oligarch class of politicians, generals, and outright criminals. A state in which the organs of state power become instruments for racketeering, repression, and corruption. Even Putin's invasion of Crimea and eastern Ukraine, for all the suffering and the loss of life inflicted by Russian soldiers and special forces. The invasion of Crimea has actually consolidated Ukrainian national identity and has led to an unprecedented mobilization of civil society in Ukraine against the Russian aggression. And moreover, the term Revolution of Dignity and Freedom, which is the name that the revolution has acquired since then, this name in itself has profoundly Hegelian overtones, especially given Hegel's sustained emphasis on freedom, Freiheit, or liberty, as well as recognition, which is implied in dignity. Recognition is key to Hegel's philosophy, recognition or Anerkennung. And these themes recur throughout his writings. And as well as claiming that, quote, the history of the world is none other than the progress of the consciousness of freedom, unquote, Hegel also insisted, quote, that liberty is the distinguishing feature of man. To renounce one's liberty is to renounce one's humanity. Ukraine's Hegelian transition, symbolized by the revolution on Maidan, entails the coming of a new freedom-loving Homo Maidanus prototype that will replace the archetypal Homo Sovieticus of the Soviet and post-Soviet eras. This is what I mean when I talk about the anthropological metamorphoses that actually even transcend the social changes that have taken place. It's a revolution that has occurred at an anthropological level. And the failure of previous revolutions in Ukraine can be explained by the persistence of the Soviet mentality, symbolized by this Homo Sovieticus prototype. The Homo Sovieticus is a type of, a kind of ideal type of human being in the sense of Max Weber. The burgeoning bureaucracy and the overbearing communist ideology which distinguished the 70-year period of Soviet rule created a new type of human being known as Homo Sovieticus. Homo Sovieticus was characterized by a degraded sense of self-worth, a distorted code of ethics, and a deformed, dysfunctional social conscience. The Soviet mentality epitomized by Homo Sovieticus far outlived the Soviet Union as a political entity. And patterns of socialization and the inculcation of Soviet values have survived and even flourished in some parts of post-Soviet Ukraine, and particularly in post-Soviet Russia. So when I talk about Homo Sovieticus, I'm referring to the kind of people who are the product of Soviet society, representing the worldview and the attitudes and values of those who were brought up in the Soviet system. People who have been enculturated in this ethos of Homo Sovieticus tend to express a longing, a nostalgia for order, for stability, for security, which are cherished far more than freedom, truth, and democracy. Homo Sovieticus, in the words of one Ukrainian commentator, is, and I quote, characterized by an adherence to a bureaucratic culture, routine rudeness, a fear of everything new, and a fear to show individuality, unquote. In philosophical or literary terms, we can refer to Homo Sovieticus as a Dostoevskian caricature of a degraded humanity which is paralyzed by the existential tension arising from the tragicomic situation of being, on the one hand, created for freedom, but on the other being too feeble and afraid to embrace the risk, responsibility, and vulnerability that freedom inevitably brings. For Homo Sovieticus, freedom is not a virtue. Freedom is not a blessing. Freedom is a curse. Freedom is a fatal gift that condemns him to perdition. So democracy is perceived as a threat or as a Western imposition, quote unquote. Homo Sovieticus doesn't want democracy or accountability, but instead longs for a strong ruler who will relieve him of the intolerable burden of freedom. Moreover, Homo Sovieticus, to the extent that he is capable of religious commitment, seeks from his religion not truth, freedom, or enlightenment, but rather the Dostoevskian triad offered by the Grand Inquisitor of miracle, mystery, and authority. The revolutionary events in Ukraine in 2013 to 14 can now be understood as the painful labor pangs that presage the birth of Homo Maidanis, which will eventually overcome Homo Sovieticus. It's not going to happen overnight, but it's a generational transition. At its best, the Maidan revolution signals what Nietzsche might have called, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche might have called, a transvaluation of values, a transvaluation of all values, eine Umwertung aller Wertung. And this is marked by a paradigm shift from Homo Sovieticus to Homo Maidanis. And this echoes Nietzsche's understanding of the overman or the superman, the Übermensch, who eventually supplants what Nietzsche called the contemptible figure of the last man or the der letzte Mensch. So this kind of transition from Homo Sovieticus to Homo Maidanis would signify what the Ukrainian-born philosopher Nikolai Berdyaev called a personalist revolution. A personalist revolution, rather than a social or political revolution, a personalist revolution, which involves, according to Berdyaev, a revolution for the sake of man and not for the sake of one society or another. So I want to argue that Ukraine has a historic opportunity to break decisively from the baleful legacy of Soviet communism by consolidating its foundations for civil society. The recent crises in the spheres of politics, society, and education betoken a new epoch, not just in the history of Ukraine, but of the entire region, for the whole of Europe, actually. And this is an epoch which has made the transition, that has passed through the post-Soviet era, and which will be determined not by the servile Homo Sovieticus, but by the freedom-loving Homo Maidanis prototype. So let's look in some more detail at this notion of civil society. What does it mean, and what is its relevance to Ukraine and indeed to Europe today? The term civil society or bürgerliche Gesellschaft was used by Hegel, the philosopher Hegel, in his major work, the Grundlinien der Philosophie des Rechts, or the philosophy of right, as it's sometimes referred to or translated into English, which was published in 1820. And in this work, Hegel used the notion of civil society to distinguish between two other spheres of ethical life, which Hegel classified firstly as die Familie, or the family, and secondly, the state, or der Staat. So we have the family, we have the state, and we also have this third realm known as civil society. In contrast to the classical tradition of political theory, represented, for instance, in the writings of Aquinas, Baudin, Hobbes, Spinoza, Locke, Kant, etc., Hegel drew a clear distinction between the political and the civil spheres of ethical public ethical life. Civil society, according to Hegel, describes a public sphere of ethical life in which individuals seek to satisfy each other's needs through work, production, and through exchange. And Hegel maintained that the role of the state was to represent universal values that transcended the irreconcilable conflicts over private interess that are inevitable consequences of citizens' participation in civil society. Now, according to Hegel, civil society and the state are mutually dependent. It's not about one ruling over the other. There's a mutual dependency insofar as the competing interests within civil society require the regulation of the state. But for its part, the state cannot reach its full ethical potential without the operation of a robust civil society. One of the most important negative functions of civil society, and this applies not just to Ukraine and the post-Soviet state, but in general, one of the most important functions of civil society is to relativize the power of the state. The sacralization of the state, or the deification of the state, which has occurred in so many post-Soviet nations, has resulted in the monopolization of the public sphere by the church and also by the state. And this has prevented the development of the foundations of civil society upon which to build viable democratic structures. The so-called harmony between the state and the official church in many post-Soviet nations, especially in Russia, explains the traditional legal nihilism and the people's unprecedented alienation from both the government and from the church. And moreover, the cozy alliances between church and state have caused the church to lose its voice of prophetic critique against governments and figures of political authority that abuse their powers. We saw this in Ukraine under Yanukovych. We're seeing it now in Russia under the authoritarian dictator, Putin. And many churches have chosen to side with the state in exchange for benefits, for patronage, and for preferential treatment. It's like a Faustian pact with the devil, to use the more colourful language. But this has occurred at the cost of the church's alienation from society. The church is no longer respected by society. It's protected by the state, but it's no longer held in esteem by society. So instead of identifying with civil society and demonstrating solidarity with the legitimate aspirations of the powerless and the marginalized, the church has tended to collude with influential individuals who wield power within the state hierarchy. The church in Ukraine, as well as in other post-Soviet states, can become salt and light for civil society by keeping a critical distance from the state and by standing with society through the public enactment of Christian virtues such as integrity, honesty, compassion, and solidarity. So one of the most important positive functions of the church within civil society is to humanize public life. To humanize public life. The flourishing of civil society depends on the dynamic operation of humanizing forces such as trust, courtesy, and integrity within social collectives. As scholars have demonstrated, one of the key arguments of Hegel's first major work, the Phenomenology of Spirit, or the Phenomenology of Mind, his major thesis is that human self-consciousness is impossible without reciprocal recognition by members of a community. One of the painful lessons of Ukraine's post-Soviet history is that civil society cannot emerge out of a context of mass demoralization or in a social space that is dominated by a criminalized governing elite in which the collective moral consciousness has been thoroughly dehumanized. Anyone who has had any dealings with the corrupt post-Soviet Ukrainian bureaucratic system will recognize this lucid description by a young Ukrainian. And she says, "It is enough to visit any public institution to encounter the Soviet past thriving in the present. Examples include hospitals, post offices, libraries, or preparing any form of official documentation. Employees working at these institutions are often rude. People have to stand in long lines, and each time it feels humiliating and uncomfortable." Amen to that, as someone who has experienced this bureaucratic system, trying to obtain, as a British citizen, a long-term missionary visa in Ukraine. I can resonate with that description. And one of the most apparent differences that Western visitors to some parts of the former USSR will notice is the general, I mean, you might notice this as well if you ever visit the region, the general lack of humane values in post-Soviet society. Basic courtesy, dignity and respect are in very short supply. And in this regard, the criminal elite under the reprobate President Yanukovych embodied some of the pathologies of large sections of the wider population. When he took power in 2010, Yanukovych set about looting the Ukrainian economy and dividing the proceeds to his inner circle of oligarchs and to his immediate family. And in just 4 years, under Yanukovych, it's estimated that he embezzled $100 billion from the state funds of Ukraine. When Yanukovych fled Ukraine, protesters entered his estate and found evidence of grotesque luxury as well as a large cache of incriminating documents that he'd actually tried to dispose of at the last minute by chucking them into a lake before he left. And it's said that he took an estimated $32 billion with him in gold and in cash. He took $32 billion of Ukraine's state funds over the border with him into Ukraine when he fled. But some of these documents were recovered, and they show that as widows and orphans and pensioners were literally freezing to death during the severe Ukrainian winters. And I was in Ukraine in the winter of 2012, and there were temperatures of minus 27 in eastern Ukraine. And I could see people literally freezing to death on the streets. But while pensioners and orphans were starving and freezing, Yanukovych was adorning his vast estate on the outskirts of Kiev with Lebanese cedar doors at the cost of $64,000 each. And the documents show that he spent $328,000 on wall paneling for his winter garden in 2012. According to local press reports, other documents included, quote, a $12 million handwritten check to an undisclosed beneficiary, and a 39 million euro chandelier supply contract. What's the point of saying this? I want to say that given the criminality at the very top of the regime, the criminality and the corruption at the very top of the regime, it was impossible for democracy and accountability to flourish at any level of Ukrainian society. And under Yanukovych's regime, the structures and social values that support civil society were fatally assaulted. Yanukovych's corrupt system of organized kleptocracy was fed by an abyss of legal nihilism into which any incipient initiatives to build up civil society ignominiously collapsed. Now, after the grotesque regime of the discredited tyrant Yanukovych, Ukrainian society required not just constitutional reform, not just a tinkering with the political system or the constitutional arrangements. Ukrainian society required a wholesale social reformation, a spiritual awakening, if we can use that language, which involved a transvaluation of values that would signify a clear break from the state-authorized crime, corruption, and indignity of the post-independence era. In this regard, Maidan came to symbolize the awakening of civil society in Ukraine. On Kiev's central square in 2013, 2014, the demonstrators organized impromptu church services, academic lectures, rousing speeches. They even set up field hospitals and soup kitchens. And headscarved babushkas, or the old women, walked the streets with flasks and cups of tea and coffee, distributing them to the protesters. People were singing songs and ballads from Ukrainian folklore, and the poetry of Taras Shevchenko was boomed out to mass crowds through loudspeakers that were placed on the Maidan. Taras Shevchenko, I should say, is to Ukraine what Shakespeare is to England, and what Goethe is to Germany, or Pushkin to Ukraine. He's their national poet and artist and playwright. And he's become a great folk figure, suppressed under the Soviet era as a revolutionary, but now being revived and rehabilitated in Ukraine in the post-Maidan era. So the civic response of ordinary Ukrainians to the Russian military aggression also facilitated a huge mobilization of Ukrainian civil society. And when the Russian army invaded Crimea and Donbass in eastern Ukraine, the Ukrainian army was wholly unable to respond effectively. One of the reasons was that the Ukrainian army under Yanukovych had been deeply infiltrated by officers who were loyal to Putin. So whenever the Ukrainian army tried to launch an attack or an offensive, the Russians seemed to just know exactly where they were going to strike. But not only was there this infiltration by Kremlin agents, many of the officers of the Ukrainian special forces under Yanukovych had been far more concerned about personal enrichment than in building up Ukraine's military capacity. And realizing the impotence of the official Ukrainian army, what happened was that literally millions of Ukrainians, ordinary Ukrainians, took matters into their own hands and began to organize local defense forces to protect their communities from Russian invaders. Despite the economic crisis, Ukrainians donated en masse to funding schemes to support these unofficial units. So doctors set up makeshift hospitals in combat zones and offered care for wounded soldiers free of charge, independently of the state. Local churches organized food deliveries to Ukrainian divisions on the front line. Low-income Ukrainians, including pensioners, donated tiny amounts to the cause, as millions of previously inactive citizens started to feel that they were Ukrainians, regardless of their ethnicity, their place of residence, or their income level. And as a result of these efforts, by 2014, it had become clear that civil society had emerged as a new force in Ukrainian public life. And this had profound implications for not just for the society and for the political system, but also for the church. So if civil society is the realm in which human values are developed for the common good of the whole public realm, then the church in the post-Soviet space is called upon to humanize society in the name of the kingdom of God. Society can rightfully expect the church to demonstrate, rather than simply preach about, the cardinal Christian virtues of faith, hope, and love, as well as solidarity. The church should uphold and champion the legitimate aspirations of ordinary people for democracy, freedom, integrity, and transparency. So my argument is that Ukraine requires not just constitutional change and the reinstitution of democratic forms of government, important though that is, but more fundamentally, Ukraine requires a warmer and deeper mode of social engagement that only a vigorous civil society can guarantee. And in Ukraine, as in many other post-Soviet states that lack developed civil societies, only the church possesses the necessary intellectual, spiritual, and creative resources to facilitate this kind of engagement. The church is called to be a humanizing force in society. This requires that the church recognizes that it is itself an integral part of civil society, which it is a society which the church is called to transform from the inside by transfiguring the degenerate post-Soviet vices of corruption, vulgarity, and disrespect with Christian values of integrity, honor, and courtesy. This kind of transformation demands a radical reformation of the church's engagement with post-Soviet society. Too often, the church has hypocritically absolved itself of political responsibility in the name of so-called gospel principles. But while talking about salvation, the soul, and eternity, all too often the church has engaged in underhand business deals and political machinations in order to preserve its interests and its privileged status and its protection by the state. Therefore, Christian values of honesty, dignity, freedom, justice, most of all compassion, need to be enculturated and embedded, not just into explicit church activities, but also in the mundane realities that govern social and political relations in the nation as a whole. One of my all-time favorite philosophers is Alexander Herzen, and I just love this quotation. Herzen said, "There will be no freedom in the world until what is religious and political are turned in to what is human and simple." There will be no freedom in the world until what is religious and political are turned into what is human and simple. So Maidan has signaled a new era in which the post-Soviet church is awakened to its social responsibilities and is able to demonstrate solidarity with the people. So the church is called to embrace a vision that my friend and my good friend and co-author, Dr. Mikhailo Cherenkov, calls open Christianity. And this book here is essentially our manifesto for an open Christianity, or we've actually used the term church without walls, which is more or less synonymous. This kind of Christianity facilitates the development of civil society by being free, humble, generous, hospitable, full of grace, and ready not just to judge and to criticize, but also to listen, to learn, to serve, and even to suffer for the sake of the kingdom of God. Mikhailo in the book puts it well. He said that the mission of the open church is to proclaim the gospel of the kingdom, to discern, to bless, to participate in its highly diversified forms, directing people both within and outside the church in their spiritual search towards an encounter with Christ, wherever this encounter might occur. A church without walls, which sees the dissemination of the values of the kingdom of God into all spheres of society as an urgent gospel imperative. This vision of Christianity will reach out and transform educational institutions, theological think tanks, the media, the arts, politics and business, and all the infrastructure of civil society. It won't just have an effect on the church. A church that wants to work in tandem with the humanizing forces of civil society will be concerned not to consolidate the authority structures of a religious institution, which is based on order and hierarchy, but will be much more involved in building authentic communities in which the values of compassion, acceptance, and hospitality and community are lived out in the context of a new order of existence made possible by the kingdom of God. Such a transformative vision of a church without walls, awakened to its responsibilities, to society, and most of all to the kingdom of God, will inspire people far more than the isolated calls of the evangelist to personal repentance. And I think it's time that the church in Ukraine, that whole region, took seriously its social responsibility to be salt and light, to build up civil society, and thereby to exert a humanizing influence on public life. So just to sum up, to conclude, looking towards the future with hope, the book is called A Future and a Hope. It's from Jeremiah's prophecy. So let's try and end on a note of hope. So I've tried to argue that the wholesale transformation of post-Soviet Ukrainian society, according to the values, the kingdom values of honesty, integrity and compassion, is a precondition to the creation of a viable and durable democratic government in Ukraine. The Ukrainian Revolution of 2013 to 14 has unleashed a new impulse for wholesale social reform and a desire to jettison, to cast off the burden of lingering neo-Sovietism and its dysfunctional modes of social interaction. It's difficult to predict what the outcome is going to be. It was Hegel who once remarked that we as human beings are all like human actors. We're all caught up in the drama, but none of us has seen the script. The owl of Nineveh, said Hegel, takes flight only at dusk, and it's likely that we'll only learn about the significance of the Maidan revolution in hindsight. But nevertheless, I think even now it's apparent that historians 100 years hence will look back at the Ukrainian revolution on Maidan as a pivotal moment in European history. Not just in the history of Ukraine, but in European history. It's the moment when Ukraine took a bold leap, as opposed to the previous timid steps, away from the post-Soviet vices of corruption, cynicism, and irresponsibility. The Maidan Revolution marks a return to the values of freedom, compassion, and solidarity that proved so fatal to the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, and which, similarly, in due course, will deliver the coup de grace to Vladimir Putin's equally discredited regime. From a Christian perspective, Maidan may prove to be God's gracious call to the churches in the post-Soviet space to engage proactively in the transformation of unjust, corrupt social structures, to demonstrate solidarity with those fighting for freedom and justice, and thereby to become salt and light to their society. The Ukrainian revolution has blazed a trail, a new trail out of the post-Soviet captivity of the church. And other countries can now follow. Other countries, other regions can now follow. Perhaps we can even speculate that whenever Putin and his corrupt government are finally forced to release their stranglehold on Ukrainian public opinion, and when the church in Russia rediscovers its true prophetic voice, then even Russia itself will have its own Maidan moment on Red Square in Moscow. Whenever this happens, and when Russian churches stand by their people in their legitimate aspirations for freedom and democracy, as their Ukrainian counterparts did in 2013 to 2014, many Christians actually paying the ultimate price. But when Russian Christians stand with their people, then the Russian Christians can expect from their Ukrainian brothers and sisters fervent prayers, material support and spiritual solidarity as they take a stand with the people on behalf of the Christian values of truth, justice, honesty, integrity, freedom, and above all, of compassion. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Joshua, for an excellent and exciting presentation. I find it very refreshing to be reminded of the Church's role and calling with respect to society around and the world around. We get so caught up in our own little world, our own business, and this is blows the window wide open, as it were, onto that world of which we are a part and which God loves. So I will restrain myself from the large number of questions I have and invite you to start the ball rolling. Trevor.
Joshua, thank you so much for a very illuminating introduction to recent history for those of us who are outside that sphere. What I would like to ask you is about other social undercurrents in the Ukraine, because I remember that in Yugoslavia, when it broke up, the Serbs and Croats were at each other's throats. And the reason for that goes back to the Second World War, when the Croats sided with Hitler. And it goes back further, because the Serbs were historically Protestants and the Croats Catholics, and there was another problem there. Is there anything like that? Because we hear about Eastern Ukraine being largely Russian-speaking. Is there anything like that going on as well in the Ukraine?
Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks, Trevor, for raising it. I think there is that dynamic there, particularly in Eastern Ukraine. But I notice, particularly in the British media, it tends to be grossly exaggerated. So some commentators even give the impression that Ukraine is essentially a divided country between Ukrainians in the West and Russians in the East. It's not true at all. I can speak from my personal experience. I have several friends who are Russian speakers who would lean culturally towards Russia, but who would actually be willing literally to fight for the unity of Ukraine against the incursions of Russian soldiers. And actually, even those Russians who speak, so even those Ukrainians those Russian-speaking Ukrainians in Eastern Ukraine who speak Russian as their first language, similarly are opposed to the Russian invasion of their country. So I think it can sometimes be exaggerated. One of the ways that the issue is exaggerated is through the Russian propaganda, which has been going into absolute overdrive, and it is absolutely toxic. It has to. I think I said in my seminar, it has to be seen to be believed. The mendacity, the way that it's poisoning people's minds, the way that the Russian media, which is controlled directly by Vladimir Putin, literally personally by Putin, the way that it creates enmity and hatred towards people. It's going to take a whole generation to repair, to bring reconciliation to those people whose minds have just been zombified by the very mendacious campaign of misinformation, which has intentionally exploited some of these cultural differences between Russian-leaning, Russian-speaking Ukrainians and those who lean more towards Europe and the West. So Ukraine is one nation. The vast majority of Ukrainians, even in the East, want Ukraine to be one country, a united country. But the propaganda, if you want to know how propaganda functions in a postmodern context, this Russia Today RT that's available on our even on our televisions in the English language, it's a fascinating example of how facts can be distorted, how they can exploit ruthlessly the postmodern postmodern suspicion of factual claims, and just very cleverly, but really, I think there's almost something. I speak as a Christian. I think that there's something quite dark and demonic about the mendacity of that campaign of fabrication and distortion, which is causing hatred and enmity, which spills over into violence. It's just as harmful as the guns and the book missiles that Russia's sending into Ukraine. The propaganda is just as harmful because it creates that enmity and conflict.
Questions? Andy?
You described the sort of call for the church to get engaged, and then all the activity within Maiden and people becoming activists. Is that more sort of individual Christian? I'm wondering, is there any sort of connectivity between the churches within the region more than there was, or is it still a sort of the individual Christian mobilization?
Yeah. No, I think it is individual Christians taking the initiative, church leaders, pastors, people in congregations. But the mobilization of civil society and the ecumenical mobilization of the churches has been a trans-denominational phenomenon. So there have been coordinated efforts. It's actually a great sign of hope to see, for instance, the Ukrainian Catholic churches working very, very closely with Ukrainian Baptists and calling them brothers for the first time since the Second World War, referring to each other as bratya, siostry, as brothers and sisters in their official communications. So great signs of hope. It's actually the hardship of the crisis and the conflict that has brought the churches together as they've realized that they have a lot more in common. The forces that bring them together are a lot stronger than those that would tear them apart. So yes, there are differences in history and doctrine, and those are all ecumenical issues. But actually, when it comes to core values of freedom, compassion, justice, dignity, solidarity, there is genuine spiritual solidarity between the churches, which has meant that the relief efforts that have taken place at the humanitarian level and also at the level of church reconciliation, they've actually been remarkably well coordinated, at least in my experience of personal involvement in those initiatives. So there were a time of great hardship and tragic, tragedy. A tragedy is unfolding in Ukraine right now as we speak, but out of that hardship there are green shoots of genuine hope. And the unity of the churches is one of the signs of hope. Yeah. it's very complicated because there are actually 3 Orthodox churches in Ukraine, and they've historically been quite divided as well. Ukraine is an Orthodox country. About 80 to 85% of the Ukrainian population claims some affiliation with the Orthodox Church. Doesn't mean that they go to church every Sunday, but they regard themselves as Ukrainian and Orthodox. So Ukraine is an Orthodox country, culturally, religiously. But that doesn't mean that it's a united country, because even within Orthodoxy there are fissures, there are divisions. So for instance, in Ukraine right now there's one patriarchate which is loyal to the patriarch in Kiev, and there's one patriarchate which is loyal to the patriarch in Moscow. And so there's the Ukrainian, they're both called the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, but one is called the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Kiev Patriarchate, the other is called the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate. And actually, one might have expected the conflict in Ukraine to have exacerbated the divisions and the tensions between the Moscow Patriarchate and the the Kiev Patriarchate, Ukrainian Orthodox churches. But actually, again, there are signs of hope because the opposite has occurred. And many in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate have been quite outspoken in their condemnation of Kremlin policy in Ukraine.
That's very interesting because the Russian Orthodox tended to be quite close to the state.
Oh, yeah.
In
Yeah, absolutely. Well, to some extent, the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow is even more extreme than the Kremlin, than Putin himself, in terms of advocating this concept of what they call the Ruski Mir, the Russian world. So Russia, the Moscow Patriarchate deliberately disseminate this ideology, this notion that Russia has a messianic imperative to save the world. To save the world firstly from Europe, which is Antichrist, and from America, which is the empire of decadence. And then in the midst of that you have Holy Mother Russia, which has this responsibility to save the world. It's a really pernicious ideology, but it's actively promoted by the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow. And actually some of those so-called dignitaries, some of the senior leaders of the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow have essentially become Putin yes-men and his foreign ambassadors, trying to persuade evangelical communities in America, for instance, fundamentalist communities in the Southern Baptists, that actually Russia is a true Christian country. And people think that Russia is a Christian. Even some evangelical fundamentalists in America, they think that Russia is a strong Christian nation, and that Vladimir Putin is a strong Christian leader because Putin is against homosexuality, and he's passed very restrictive legislation against homosexuals, against transgender people, against people of non-traditional sexuality, to use the jargon term. And this makes Putin a Christian in their eyes. And what's happening with tragic consequences is history is repeating itself in tragedy rather than in farce. If you look at the 1930s in Germany under Hitler similarly produced. He was very committed, he said, to traditional family values. The Nazis were going to restore traditional understandings of sexuality and family, and actually several tens of thousands of homosexuals were gassed in the concentration camps. And Hitler actually claimed he had a sort of pseudo-Christian ideology. I'm reading Michael Burleigh's New History of the Third Reich at the moment. It's absolutely fascinating. It describes all this. But the way that Hitler presented himself as a Christian crusader, fighting for Christian values against against Judaism and against the decadence of Western civilization. So we see I think Hitler and Putin are quite parallel figures, actually. The only difference is that Putin has nuclear weapons. Hitler didn't.
I mean, you hinted quite a bit about the implications of what's going on in Ukraine for Europe as a whole.
Yeah.
Could you just develop that a little more than you have done? I'm assuming it's more than just Russia's going to get Ukraine and who's Russia going to invade next.
Yeah.
I'd be interested more in terms of the wider perspective of that.
No, that's a fair comment, a good question, because I didn't really have time to develop that with the focus mainly on Ukraine. But I think it does have really significant, decisive implications for Ukraine. I'm going to out myself as a sort of left-of-centre socialist at this stage. But I am concerned about the rise of far-right parties like throughout Europe. So if it's Jobbik in Hungary, if it's Le Front National in France, if it's UKIP here in the UK, far-right anti-immigrant populist parties that all, to some extent, claim to be they run on the agenda of reasserting Christian values. So these right-wing parties, we're seeing this phenomenon throughout Europe. We're actually seeing the emergence of a new polarity in Europe. So whereas previously we were given, or the countries of Europe at elections, at general elections, were given a choice between left of centre or right of centre, they're now given a choice between slightly right of centre and parties like the National Front and UKIP and everything else. And we're seeing this in Hungary, which has a right-wing government that professes loyalty to Putin. We see this in the Czech Republic, where there's another populist, anti-immigrant right-wing leader. It's quite painful for me because I spent a lot of time in the Czech Republic to see the way that that country is going politically. We see it in France, where the National Front, an explicitly Nazi party, obtains, was it about 30% of the popular vote just a couple of weeks ago. We see this phenomenon, we see the rise of UKIP winning a major national election, the European elections last year. So we're seeing this phenomenon of right-wing popularism, which has quite anti-democratic impulses, emerging throughout Europe. And it's no coincidence that all of those parties, National Front in France, UKIP, and the populist parties in Czech Republic and Hungary, these parties are all outspoken advocates of Putin. And they've declared themselves enemies of the Ukrainian revolution, to the extent that Marie Le Pen is saying that Russia's invasion of Crimea was fully justified, that France and Europe should recognize the invasion and annexation, etc. So if Putin has his way in Ukraine, then the whole of Eastern Europe is threatened with political and ideological extinction. We could even see the emergence of a new era of Russian-led serfdom, not just in Ukraine, but in Eastern Europe, the Baltic countries, Poland, Romania. There's serious concern in all of these countries. In fact, people are openly talking about it and speculating. Is Putin going to engage in the sort of brinkmanship that will result in nuclear bombs falling on countries like cities like Warsaw, Bucharest, Vilnius in Lithuania? And in Kiev at the moment, they're actually building deep underground bunkers, mass bunkers for people to take shelter in the eventuality of nuclear weapons falling on Kiev. So it is being taken very, very seriously. We haven't realized in the West how serious this could become. And I think that we need to defend and stand up for Ukraine, because if we don't, the implications for the whole of that region, indeed for the whole of Europe, are absolutely dire. Yeah, sorry to sound so sort of negative, but it's the reality that we're confronted with
Can I
now.
just pick up on that? It's an interesting point, because I was going to talk about looking to the future with hope. And this presented a kind of balancing possibility. But Hegel is known, is he not, as one of the sort of founding fathers of the 19th century doctrine of progress, famous or infamous. And most people would say that from a Christian point of view, a Christian reading of the 20th century is that doctrine has been sort of pretty thoroughly demolished. But what you are offering us is actually a fairly positive view of Hegel and the ideal of freedom, and the sense that you didn't quite say inevitable, but the sense that this is the way things are going. Civil society is being built up. So, in Christian terms, what is your underlying eschatology? Post-millennialists?
No.
Pre-millennialists? I mean,
Yeah.
you don't need to use those terms, but...
Yeah, none of the above. But it's a very good question. It's a fair question as well. Yeah, I think that sometimes, as Christians, we can be naively optimistic about the course of history, that everything is going to resolve itself in the end, and there's going to be freedom and justice and light and everything else. For Ukrainians, that doesn't really make a lot of sense at the moment, particularly for those who have lost loved ones in the conflict, and thousands have died, over 1 million refugees. It's very difficult to persuade them that history is moving in this direction. But I still think that there is a basic underlying messianic principle in history, and I know that I'm not postmodern at all in saying this. I would be shouted down by some of my postmodern friends. But I think that there is something about history, whether we refer to the sovereignty of God or the providence of God, the activity of God in history. And I do believe that. I do believe that God is living and active in the world. And I do believe that praying Christians can make a difference, to not just to personal lives and praying for individual people who are sick, etc., but to the destiny of nations. That gives me hope and that gives me confidence. So I would say that I'm cautiously optimistic about the way that things will go, and I realise that it's not a sort of straight road to freedom and light and justice and everything else. It's a very convoluted and painful travail to get to this culmination point. But I think that there is hope, and I think we have to live with the hope. Yeah.
Somebody want to follow on?
Yes, your talk was really fascinating, and I've been thinking about the wider implications, not just for Europe, but Africa and so on, and in the Middle East, because it's putting such a responsibility on Christians, especially what can happen in areas where Christians are simply not evident. But also a question about there tends to be a human inclination to look to a leader, in Britain as well as elsewhere. Are there any leaders that are coming that we should look out for that can lead Ukraine in a strong way?
Well, I think the leaders that they have at the moment are certainly a lot better than they had this time 2 years ago. I don't know if I can identify individuals who could lead, but I would like to highlight the Ukrainian president who took over as an interim president after Yanukovych fled in February 2014. His name was what was his name? Alexander Turchinov. And Alexander Turchinov is a Baptist preacher. And it's the first time in the history of the post-Soviet era that a Baptist had become the head of state of a post-Soviet country. And he was, if I can use this, it's almost like he was God's man for the hour. Because if someone else had taken over, someone with a slightly hotter head and resisted the Russian occupation of Crimea, we would have seen slaughter on an unbelievable scale. In Crimea, we would have seen the full invasion of eastern Ukraine. We would have potentially seen the threat or the actual deployment of nuclear weapons if they had resisted, because Putin said that in an interview a couple of weeks ago, that he was prepared to use nuclear weapons over Crimea. And so Turchinov, with his Baptist principles and his backgrounds, he said, he made a decision not to resist violently the Russian invasion of Crimea. So I think he was an example of a good leader, and he often doesn't get enough credit because he took over in appalling, horrendous circumstances. And people said, well, he wrecked the economy. Well, the economy was wrecked from the $100 billion that Yanukovych put into his back pocket from the Ukraine state funds. I'm actually quite optimistic about cautiously optimistic about the current Ukrainian president, Petro Poroshenko. He's a Christian. I think he's not a Baptist, but he's an Orthodox Christian. And I think that there is a new openness for democracy and accountability among the leaders in Ukraine. I think a lot of that is to do with the way that the church has become awakened to its social and political responsibilities and has begun to exert a leavening effect on the political system. So Christian leaders are beginning to emerge in Ukraine. I think that's a sign of hope. Absolutely, yeah. There's something I wanted to say about your question as well, Stephen. Just quickly, you mentioned about this, modernist ideology of progress and how that's been discredited by recent trends in postmodern thought. Mikhailo actually wrote an essay about this, about the extent to which Maidan signals the end of postmodernity, particularly in the Ukrainian context, because people suddenly discovered that actually there were such things as facts that needed to be reported and reported honestly. There were such values as truth, freedom, democracy, independence, that people weren't just willing to write about and defend theoretically, but they were willing to die for these values, for these ultimate values. There were such things as ultimate values, and people were willing to live and to die for them. So he actually talks about how Maidan signals the end of postmodernity for Ukraine.
And that is really interesting and encouraging. I think the point about the modernist ideal of progress, I think that can be challenged from other grounds other than postmodern thinking and facts and so on. But I think just readings of history of the last 100 or 200 years would consider a question mark over that, just as a historian, never mind a postmodern philosopher. But, I suppose what you said brings me to one of the other fundamental things I was thinking was that, you've given us here in this context what seems to be, a really strong prophetic kind of message, asserting truth in the face of a lot of lies. But my question is, how will those who have been blinkered by these lies for years, almost now for generations, it's been going on for since the early years of the communist takeover, hasn't it? How will they be convinced? How can this truth penetrate into the places where it needs to penetrate?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is where the church needs to be mobilized and to speak a word of truth into society, to speak the truth to power, to expose the lies. The best way to dissipate a shadow is to cast light on it.
Yeah.
And this is all that it needs for the truth to prevail. I suppose I am a bit old-fashioned in modernist in saying that, but I believe that the truth has an integrity.
You don't need to apologise for that.
But I think this is where the churches can make a real difference.
Yeah.
By bringing reconciliation. Blessed are the peacemakers. We need a generation of leaders in the church who will reach out, who will break down the barriers of hatred and enmity that have been created by these very calculated propaganda initiatives. There are Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine who literally hate their fellow countrymen and women as a result of this very wicked campaign. I think it does such an injustice to Ukraine. You go to Ukraine, I noticed immediately the difference between Ukraine and Russia when I visited both countries. When I visited Ukraine for the first time, I absolutely loved it. The people were sort of open, and they were actually liable to burst into song every time you had a conversation with one of them. Music and culture, and it's in the DNA of the Ukrainian people. I went to Moscow, and it was like hell on earth. It was absolutely the worst experience of my entire life. And I think a lot of it had to do with, you can't just blame the government, but I think that just this bureaucratic Soviet culture of inhumanity, just a total lack of compassion and decency and courtesy and human values that you would find in Ukraine. So I think that's why the propaganda is so pernicious, because it's poisoning people's minds and turning them into little Putins. Yeah.
Well, I think we appreciated Joshua's prophetic passion and insight, so let's show that.